question. Can the balanced budget be sort of compared to like the Montrose rule at all? Like I was thinking about that.
It can be compared in the sense it's a rigid rule. I mean, if you have a constitutional amendment that says Congress has to balance the budget, there's a rule for you. You got to do it. Just like the monitors have a rule on growing the money supply. But what happens if you balance the budget every year?
No government spending.
When the economy goes into a recession, less people working, so your tax revenues go down. More people drawing unemployment, the welfare. And so just when you're going into a recession, you move into a deficit. Right? Mm-hmm. And then you say, oh, we got to balance the budget. In fact, it's now a constitutional amendment, assume it was. If you have to balance the budget, what do you have to do with spending and what do you have to do with taxes? You have to either raise taxes or cut spending or some combination of the two. And what will that do to the recession?
Depression.
Yeah, the recession gets worse. So the idea of a balanced budget, it gets floated up by senators and congressmen periodically, every few years. And they simply either never took or never learned principles of economics. Most fundamental principle.
Some people talk about they should be balancing the budget or we should be focusing on that. They don't really know.
Well,
Once we get out of them.
today, even if you say we don't have to balance it every year, but we need to balance it right now. If we try to balance it right now, that's what I've been referring to as the austerity arguments, right? And if you practice austerity right now, you're going to see our country in the same shape as Italy, Portugal, Greece, Spain. They're not doing well at all. They have riots in the streets. People your age have a 50% unemployment rate in Spain. So, how long will that last until they get their budget balanced? Okay, maybe what if it takes them a year to balance their budget, 2 years to balance their budget, and then they take off and they're healthy? Was it worth it? That's the question you got to ask, because you're inflicting tremendous personal pain on your citizens when you do that. Is there an alternative? What do you think? What? What's the alternative?
The money supply.
Well, we've increased the money supply to where interest rates are zero, and that's not doing us any good because why?
No one wants to borrow.
What do we call that?
Liquidity.
We're in a liquidity trap, okay? So the alternative then, if we can't increase the money supply to stimulate the economy, is?
Government spending.
Yeah, more government spending, bigger deficits. Do we want to go further into debt? Nobody wants to, but would that be the more judicious move in the scenario we have today? The argument in favor of that is we're borrowing money today at almost 0% interest rate, real interest. So if there's ever a time to borrow money, it's now. And if you sank that money into things like infrastructure, roads, bridges, things that are going to last a long time, on borrowed money that didn't cost you any interest, that's not too bad. And it creates jobs in the process. If you invested that money into, I don't know, solar and wind energy, if you're into those things. If you invested that money into, how about this one? What if we took that money that we borrowed and invested it into educational programs that train people in vocational skills as opposed to college education? For people who can go out and go to work 1 or 2 years out of high school. Because is everybody really suited to go to college? And the answer is obviously not. Look at our dropout rate of kids who don't even show up, who don't even finish high school. And then look at the attrition rate in college. Any idea what percentage of students who go to college have to take remedial preparatory classes before they can take college level classes? What percentage of students?
A heck of a lot.
50%? Okay.
If not above that.
And what does that tell you? Does that tell you that our educational system is a disaster in public schools? Maybe to a degree, but what else does it tell you?
Standards are really high in college.
Huh?
The standards are pretty high in college. Yeah.
That those students aren't prepared to go to college, but if they're not prepared, suited, mentally, emotionally, determination, then can we give them an alternative? An alternative career track, an alternative training program. And suppose we took you, when you finished high school or even your last year of high school, we said, okay, Gavin, we're going to make you a Mason. And every day you're going to go to school from 8 to 12, and from 12 to 5, you're going to go work for, George Smith Masonry as an apprentice. And after 2 or 3 years working as an apprentice, you become self-sufficient,
Right.
earning your own income, paying taxes, etc. Well, how much of an investment in our education system would we have to make to fund a really viable, what I'm going to call vocational educational system? Europe does it.
Yeah.
Germany's incredibly good at it.
They
But
used to let
instead,
you go to work after,
Yeah,
or go to
we
work
have
after you
vocational
finish school
school
for a
in
little while, years back.
we used to have these programs in the States, and
I wish they'd still do it.
I agree.
A whole lot of people would learn a whole lot more
They
than
kind
they
of do in
do.
Orlando. They have vocational school that they make some students go out of school, do it, and go back to high school.
And what's the image of vocational school?
It's just a way to get more training for a job.
Well, I mean, it's just like the car mechanics, it's like the people that they go and it's like
The
the
car mechanics.
you're not going to make a lot of money, is the image. It's
But
that you're
there-
not going
but
to do
I-
really well.
To me, the stigma, it had a stigma to it. It said, oh, you're not smart enough to go to college, so
Yeah,
go over
exactly.
here.
Yep.
Exactly.
And that's just the wrong message. We've been sending your generation and the generation before you, been sending you the message, you should all go to college.
And then vocational school is lesser.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't buy that.
They sure make more money than we do.
Have
You damn right they do.
Yeah. Have you read? Robert Greene has a new book out. It's called Mastery. It's like the art of being an apprentice. It's actually
No, I have not. Robert Greene.
Robert Greene.
Email me that if you think I would.
Okay.
I would really like to read that.
Definitely. I haven't read it yet, but I've heard a bunch of really good reviews. I thought about reading it. It's called Mastery. It's the name of the book, so yes.
So my question would be, if we can borrow money cheap and we can invest it in something that's going to pay long-run dividends, should we do it? What's the argument against that?
Yeah, we go into more deficit.
We're going to get further and further into debt, and at some point we're going to be so far in debt, nobody's going to want to lend us money.
We're so interdependent with everyone else, that's not likely going to happen.
Yeah, I think you're right. For example, if we get really, really far into debt and our largest debtor or creditor nation, China, who has loaned us the most money of any other country, are they going to turn to us and say, we're not going to loan you any more money and watch our economy collapse?
Nope.
Because if we collapse, we can't pay them. See, they need us as much as we need them, at least to a degree.
That and we buy all their junk.
We buy all their junk, and we're hoping someday soon they'll start buying some of ours. I don't know. Dr. Paul Krugman has a name for the people who are worried about so much debt that interest rates go high and we can't borrow money, that nobody will lend us money. He calls those people who are worried about that, they're afraid of the bond vigilantes. Okay? A bond is how we borrow money, and the vigilantes are the folks out there who are going to say, nope, can't borrow any more money. You guys are too far in debt. And Krugman says, if they're out there, where are they? Because we're borrowing money dirt cheap right now, and everybody's standing in line to loan us money. Where are those vigilantes? I think that's an interesting argument.
A lot of stuff like how you have to explain the stimulus plan is that the general public only knows things in terms of how they deal with their own family, not how governments
Very good
and
point.
stuff
That
work.
the average American thinks about budgets and deficits as though it was their family.
So,
And
us
what's the
personally,
fallacy there? Say again?
Us personally, we have vigilantes. We get too much debt, bank won't give us anything.
Then the bonds are the bond vigilantes, the banks are the bond vigilantes, and they're certainly there. They'll cut you off. Okay.
Governments, no.
But what happens when we talk about our entire economy and say, oh, we don't have enough money, we need to cut spending? What happens? We destroy our ability to bring in any more revenues, any more tax money.
To get out of that recession at all.
Yeah. If you behave like you or I would as a family, wow, we don't have enough money, we're too far in debt. Cut our spending, right? And maybe pick up a second job to bring in some revenue. Well, that's great for a family. But when you translate that into the macro economy, and you tell all of us to stop spending, and you start maybe taxing all of us to pay off that deficit, all you do is collapse the economy. Now, we talked about that with Keynes. We called it a fallacy of composition. You remember that? What was true for one in isolation in the economy is not true for the entire economy when you apply it. And this is another fallacy of composition. That by cutting spending and perhaps raising taxes, but especially cutting spending, that we are in some way going to rescue ourselves. We may, but we don't know how long it'll take and how much the pain will be. Yeah. Say again? Anyway.
On top of that, like you said, even with the China thing, the bond vigilante is not loaning us any more money. Even if somebody was to do that, wouldn't that pretty much wouldn't collapse, but it would really harm the entire world economy?
Sure. As you said, we're so interdependent one with another.
Yeah.
That well, look what's happened in Europe. They're cutting off Greece and Spain right now.
They're not even close to the size of the United States.
Yeah,
as well. So.
but just look what that's doing. As Greece and Spain are folding, who do you suppose the biggest customers for German exports were?
Right.
So suddenly Germany is seeing its situation becoming more dire. So yeah, you're so interdependent. It's not. And imagine the position of the Germans. They're being asked by the Spanish and the Greeks, you guys need to help us pay off our debts, or we're going to go down and take you with us. And the Germans are saying, you got yourself in this damn problem. You fix it. Don't put it on me. Well, it doesn't work that way.
Right.
We're all in this together. So it gets interesting.
But if they were to get out of it, or if we were to get away from everybody and actually get dependent or just independent, then they wouldn't be able to do anything, right? Like if you were able to do everything yourself, then
Well,
you have to worry about
to the
anybody.
extent that you become independent, you also become less invested in commerce and trade with other nations, and you lose markets for your goods and jobs. And okay, you're independent, but your standard of living is going to shrink. Because we know that with increased international trade, we create more jobs for everybody in the long run. Now also, by the way, in the short run, that's killing American wages, because we're having to be competitive with everybody else. But if we said, okay, we're not going to have anything to do with anybody else, we'll be self-sufficient, you can do that. What would happen if you or I decided we're going to be self-sufficient in our personal life? We're not going to depend on anybody for a job or income. We're just going to take care of ourselves. What would happen? What would happen to your standard of living?
Go live in the woods and pick some berries.
Just exactly.
They have shows on that now. People living out in Alaska on the last frontier.
And I got to tell you, I don't want to live that way.
I like air conditioning.
I like my heater.
Yeah, I like my.
There is a good series on PBS. I think it just finished. It's a movie by what's his name? Kenneth. Great Civil War historian. His name just went out of my mind. It's called The Dust Bowl. Remember what the Dust Bowl was? This is graphic images and narration that really shows you what the Dust Bowl was like. And part of it was caused by the farmers and the way they plowed their land and allowed the dirt to be picked up when they had droughts. They just picked up, and you see pictures of a dust storm coming. And I mean, it's a wall of dust, dirt really, and it's 100, 200, 300 feet high. And when it comes through, at times it leaves 3 feet of dirt, just like a snowstorm, but it's dirt. And you look at that kind of stuff and what those folks went through. It was amazing.
That doesn't melt either.
Say again?
That doesn't melt.
No, that doesn't melt. No, what they eventually did, you got to imagine, these are very independent farmers, and their attitude is, we don't need the damn government. And then what happened? Once things got really bad, it was, we need some help here. So eventually, the federal government came in and paid them to plow their land back level, just like clearing snowdrifts, right? And start planting according to the contours of the land, which makes that dirt much less likely to blow away and allows plants to establish themselves and the root systems that keep the dirt in place. They eventually fixed it. But it took a hell of a lot of federal assistance.
What year was that? What year?
Began in 1931. 1937 was probably the worst year. 1939 it pretty well finished up.
31 through 39.
Yeah, imagine 6 or 7 or 8 years where you can't plant a crop, where you are literally in dirt up to your hips. And then you see the pictures of the ones who immigrated back over to California. And you talk about living independently. I mean, they're living in shelters, in shelter half over a couple of sticks. They're living out of their cars or their trailers that they were carrying. And I mean, poverty level existence. And when those same people from Oklahoma, northern Texas, when they came into California, how do you suppose the Californians treated them? They treated them the same way they did the blacks at the time. One of the theaters said, blacks and Okies, they called them collectively Okies, all y'all sit upstairs. You're not allowed to sit with the rest of us. They were discriminated against. It was something else. This is something we never learned, I think, in most of our high school history. It's an excellent, I think it's probably 3 hours video. I've got it recorded now on my DVR, but I don't know how the hell to take that and, put it on a DVR.
It's a special way to go through the internet to do that.
Yeah, way beyond my technical expertise.
Mine too.
All right, anything else on your mind?
Once we fix all of this all of this debt and everything, eventually, do you think everyone collectively will become more interdependent because they'll be all paranoid that we're going to get in so much debt again with each other?
It takes us, one argument is it's 30-year cycles. It takes us 30 years to forget everything we knew and repeat it again. And maybe it takes 50 years because we just forget the lessons. In particular, our legislators forget the lessons. Just like trying to balance the budget. So the pendulum is going to swing for the rest of your lives. Recognize which way it's swinging and how to take advantage of that.
Which way, if you had to guess right now, which way do you think our budget will be balanced eventually? By deep depression or by by the GDP itself coming back?
I think by GDP coming back, but primarily because we have so much more media in our lives today that we're more aware of what's going on and we can communicate more to our legislators. I think the Republican Party, the far right wing of it, is seeing that most of America didn't really care for some of their agenda. And I think and I hope that between Obama and the moderate Republicans, they're going to find a solution to this fiscal cliff, and they're going to work together to design things that's going to make the wings on both sides unhappy.
Correct.
But I think we can negotiate that and put this economy back on a growth path. But it's not going to be cheap, not going to be easy, and it's not going to be quick. But it's going to be a lot cheaper, a lot easier, and a lot quicker than just waiting until things get better.
Yeah. At least take some action.
Yeah. Anything else?
We're still going to go into the supply side economics and like all the things that Reagan was doing that Johnson didn't have.
There's a video about the Reaganomics, the Reagan economics program. I think I want to do that when we come back Monday. But if you look at the video, we're going to do the same thing in class. It's very much there. Let me maybe just an overview so we understand. If in fact this is long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, what happens up here, as far as what we've talked about so far in the course, what happens to this graph when we have huge tax cuts? What happens to this graph?
Tax cuts.
Aggregate demand. We focused on, as Keynes did, we focused on what happens to aggregate demand. And so you say, well, we have big tax cuts, we'd have an increase in aggregate demand. But what about businesses if they get tax cuts, if they get faster depreciation schedules, which is a tax advantage, if they get a reduction in the amount of regulation and regulatory compliance they have to fulfill? I mean, if they could spend less money on complying with regulations that maybe we don't really need, if they could have lower taxes, and if in the process they saw consumers getting ready to spend more money because they had tax cuts, would that also increase aggregate supply? And see, Keynes doesn't speak to that, because Keynes is always talking about what are we going to do down here when we're in a depression. But when you start talking about, well, what about out here somewhere? Well, tax cuts have a beneficial effect on the supply side as well. Businesses suddenly have more money available. What is it that will cause those businesses to spend that money in producing more inventory, more capital goods, creating jobs, more construction? What do they have to have?
More customers.
Customers. And if customers are getting tax breaks, then business optimism goes up. And arguably, anyway, you get an increase in supply. Let's imagine that you had an increase in long-run supply out to here. So in this case, we're doing a whole lot better.
I feel like all of the tax cuts stuff completely, entirely depends on consumer confidence and as well as, confidence of the people on the supply side.
You bet.
Yeah, because of the fact that, like, okay, they give me, if we're in a recession and they give me a ton of tax cuts because we're in a recession, the first thing I'm not thinking about doing, I'm not thinking about going out and spending that money. I'm thinking about saving it because, like, I don't know how much longer this recession is going to be. My confidence level isn't very high. Same as businesses.
You bet.
Like, they're not going to go and pump a bunch of money in their company when they get a break. They're going to put it away.
They're afraid, as they are today. Would it be fair to say macroeconomics is a mind game?
Yeah.
Sure, because so much of macroeconomic performance is based on expectations. And those are very subjective. And in fact, Keynes had a term for that in a sense. He called it animal spirits. He says, when the animal spirits go to work, you don't know for sure what's going to happen and when. But you hope you can trigger enough of that kind of positive behavior to improve the economy. Yeah. So, if in fact you can shift supply as well as aggregate demand, and to make this more meaningful, let's draw it a little bit differently. Rather than talking about the long-run aggregate supply curve, suppose you have a short-run aggregate supply curve here, and you have an aggregate demand curve here, and you say, well, gee, if we cut taxes and we increase aggregate demand, look how much more output and jobs we get. Fine, that's pure Keynes. But then the supply side comes along and says, well, wait a minute, you also get an increase in supply. Supply curve shifts to the right. You're not going to go to here. You're going to go to here. And you're going to have a huge increase in output and jobs. And again, this is part of the attraction of Reagan. It sounded pretty darn good. We spent several years in a stagflationary economy. People were hurting for jobs. That should sound very attractive today to people who don't have jobs. And it's a good argument behind why we need some tax cuts. But then the question is, what are we going to do with those tax cuts? Do businesses need tax cuts? I don't know, because they're sitting on $2 trillion in cash now they're not spending.
Right. What's the overall mood of the country in terms of confidence?
And that's, I think, kind of the part of the president's job, because he does have the pulpit where he can get attention, is how does he energize us and raise our expectations? Ronald Reagan was incredibly good at that. He was called the great communicator.